So I'm going to hand over now to Louise to start our meeting off with a talk about the Palestinian Teaching Trade Unions.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me again. So, as has been said, the NEU has a long history of supporting the Palestinian people, and one of the ways that we do that is by taking delegations out twice a year in February and October. And one of our key partner in that work is the General Union of Palestinian Teachers. So they organise visits to schools throughout the West Bank. We don't obviously go to Gaza. It's very hard to get. It would be probably impossible now, but even before the current situation, it was very hard to get permits to go into Gaza. Anyway, so we do have very good links with the union, and they, interestingly, this year for the first time managed to get visas to come to the UK and visited our annual conference. So Carol sent me a few questions, quite a lot of questions actually about trade unions there. So I'll try and deal with some of those, and then people can ask me further questions if they like. I would just say something about the current situation for schools in Gaza. So just so people are aware, schools have been heavily targeted in the current conflict. So over 250 schools have been hit, damaged, and 45 schools have been totally destroyed since the 7th of October. And there's been no education provided at all to children, because most of the schools facilities now are being used as shelters for the internally displaced people. So 600,000 children have been without education since the 7th of October. And obviously we know very high numbers of children have been killed, well over 6,000 now. So we know that will have an impact, but also high numbers have also been injured, quite significantly injured, and are struggling to get access to medical treatment. And the sort of long-term impact of what is currently happening, which is, the worst situation. Certainly the worst situation since the Nakba. We've seen quite significant incursions and hostilities in the Gaza Strip, but nothing on this scale previously. So it is very horrific what children are seeing and witnessing, and the long-term impact of that is going to be significant. I was looking at some pictures that had come out from northern Gaza during that humanitarian pause, and the level of destruction of homes, public buildings is horrific, really. So how anything is going to sort of continue, even when we eventually get to a ceasefire point, is quite worrying. In terms of the West Bank, the General Union of Palestinian Teachers oversees all teachers across the West Bank, Gaza, but also in refugee camps outside of the area that are Palestinian refugee camps in other countries. So that is their role. To be fair, I was asked a question about who is in the majority of teachers are in the union, because that is just the way it is. So the majority of teachers are members of the General Union of Palestinian Teachers. They do organise across schools, and they have taken over the past few years quite a significant amount of strike action, particularly around pay. Obviously, at the moment, no educators in Gaza will be receiving any salary because none of them are working. But my understanding is that the salaries of teachers in the West Bank has also stopped because funding through to the Palestinian Authority has stopped. So the teachers in the West Bank are also not getting their salaries. In terms of education in the West Bank, it's very difficult. And organising politically is very difficult. So even, for example, moving about the areas is difficult for the union officials. So the General Secretary cannot go into certain parts, so cannot go to East Jerusalem, for example, and meet with members there, because he's not allowed to travel into East Jerusalem. So he can only go to certain areas and visit members there, as is the case for other members of the union executive. It has always been a very heavily male dominated trade union. That is true. And we as a union recognise that very early on. We've engaged with them quite actively around that. We've set up a women's engagement programme with them, which we fund as a union. And that has seen significant engagement of women across the West Bank and Gaza, actually, who took part in that programme. And has seen an increase, and the union is engaging with us on things like ensuring that a certain percentage of its executive are women members, and ensuring that women are represented at all levels in the union. So that whilst things are difficult and it's not brilliant, it's no different actually to how my trade union was a few years ago, but the union is committed to engaging and working with that. In terms of member engagement, it's actually quite high. So I went to an election in the last round of elections in Tulkarem, and there were around 1,000 members at a members meeting to vote for who they wanted to be elected into positions. Well, that certainly doesn't happen in my union. You know, you're lucky if you get. I mean, we had a members meeting last week here in Nottingham, and you know, we had about 40 members. We think that's quite good. So, you know, the engagement of members in that political process is quite high. There is another trade union for kindergarten workers, for nursery workers. So that's a separate union, smaller union. But that again is very proactive in engaging with members. Schooling is, because Carol asked about whether people pay for schooling. Generally, schooling is free, but there are private schools, and there's a big concerns, particularly around, in the refugee camps, around the UNRWA schools, so the United Nations Relief Agency schools, and their salaries are lower, and a lot of people feel that they don't get the funding that they should get, which is probably true. So there are some concerns around what people access in those schools and their facilities, and that situation will probably deteriorate given cuts to funding. In terms of generally in the West Bank, education and education workers have a lot of difficulties at their everyday life, and these are things that I witness when I go. So there are multiple checkpoints everywhere you go in the West Bank, and sometimes education workers are stopped and they are refused access through to their school. Students are regularly stopped and searched. I have witnessed myself, I've been in a primary school where the military came in, the Israeli military came into the school, went onto the roof of the building, tried to close the school because they wanted to bring a settler group through. This was in Hebron, and were trying to tell the head teacher that he had to send all the children home, which he didn't do. But there was a lot of intimidation, and I'm a primary teacher, seeing like heavily armed military people in schools, on the roofs of schools, intimidating staff and children was quite shocking, really. The other thing that schools face is a lot of tear gas bombing, particularly in Hebron, also in Bethlehem, the refugee camp there. In fact, the refugee camp in Bethlehem is the most tear gas place in the world. So there's a lot of attacks on schools. So I visited a school. I could see and smell the tear gas as we went in, and the children had been out on the playground, and the military had fired tear gas into the playground, and a couple of the children were hospitalised. And we met with the staff there, and they talked about their general experiences. And in most of the schools, when you talk to children, what they talk about most is this issue of not being able to get to school safely, their fear about traveling to school, their fear about what happens to them at checkpoints and being searched. And also, I think that situation has deteriorated in the West Bank. So talking to teachers that I know out there now, it was very bad before, but since the 7th of October, that situation has got much worse. So there is much more intimidation at checkpoints, much more intimidation generally. There's much more arming of settlers are armed generally anyway, but they feel much more able to use their arms and to attack people who, you know, Palestinians who are going to school, or educators. So that is a real problem. In terms of political organisation, it is very difficult because obviously, you know, these are people who live under occupation. Their main focus is always about just trying to get by in life, really, and sort of work against the occupying forces in terms of trying to get on with their daily lives. But there has been a coalition of trade unions set up, which are actively campaigning against particularly what is happening now in Gaza. And they have put out some calls to trade unions. So, GUPT is part of that, the General Union of Palestinian Teachers. But there's a whole list of trade unions that are part of that. And I can send this document to you, Carol, and the link to their website. But they are calling on trade unions globally in relevant industries to take a number of actions. And it basically, it's saying that trade unions shouldn't be silenced, because I think what they're recognizing is that there is a huge attempt to silence people globally from talking out about Palestinian rights and the human rights abuses that are happening. So they're asking for us to refuse to build weapons destined for Israel, to refuse to transport weapons, to pass motions in their trade unions opposing what is happening, to take action, boycott, divestment and sanction actions against complicit companies, and to pressure governments to stop military trade with Israel, and in the case of the US, to stop funding it. So that it is quite a good coalition. I think it's fairly new in sort of the work that they are doing, but it's certainly something that we have engaged with in Palestine Solidarity Campaign and are talking about in the trade union movement in terms of the work that we need to do to speak out about what is happening, really. And I suppose I'll sort of end with that, really, that our job, for me as trade unionists, is to not allow ourselves to be silenced. And I think, you know, the NEU has been very vocal from the start of this latest assault on Gaza. We've been very vocal about what has been happening, and we've tried to get our members out, as have a number of other trade unions. But there has been huge pressures on trade unions, but actually on the general population and on the solidarity movement to be silenced. And we have a job to do to build people's confidence and make sure we continue speaking out.
Thank you very much, Louise. It's, gosh, I mean, I put the shock face up there a few times while you were talking. These poor children, you know, stopped at checkpoints to getting to school. I mean, it's almost unbelievable. You talked about the gender balance. I'm really interested to know. I mean, I don't know the Palestinian Authority or whatever. Is there an Islamic influence? Are girls prevented from attending school, or is there equality in both genders attending school?
Sorry, I didn't answer that, and you did ask that question. There's no, I mean, there are primary, generally schools are mixed. So generally in primary schools, there will be mixed schools. Secondary schools, there are some separation of gender, so girls' schools and boys' schools. There is a real focus on education in Palestine, actually. So it's considered very important, and there's a huge investment from individuals, more so than funding, actually. But there's a real belief in education being something that is really important for their culture. And so there is no stopping of girls going to school at all. Girls generally do very well in education and often go on to university. In fact, I'm involved with an organisation there who is providing funding to girls to go on to university because they live in very low income families. So obviously university they do have to pay for. So I'm trying to work with UCU at the moment to try and get funding to support some of these girls going through to university to ensure they continue. But actually, when you look at, and I don't really like any of these sort of national data figures or international data figures, but actually in terms of their they come out very highly in terms of particularly literary attainment. So there's a very big commitment to education, and there's no attempt. In fact, it's more I would say, from my experience and what I see, it's more boys that drop out of education than girls. Girls tend to.
Gosh. Wow, that's really encouraging. That's wonderful to hear. I don't want to monopolize you. If anybody else, I'm sure there must be loads of other questions that people would like to ask about how things run. I'd just like to ask a little bit more about the coalition and how we can help. You mentioned funding to get children into university. If you can send all these details to us, you know, these organizations that we can contribute to help education, because obviously education is always the key to everything. But if if you could send all of that to us, I'd be really grateful. Craig, we can't hear you, Craig. You're muted.
I know. I'm trying to make it unmute. I think I've done it now. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you now, loud and clear. Yeah.
Thank you. Not so much. Well, it is a question, I suppose. Thank you, Louise. That was really fascinating, especially, you know, the difficulties that the teachers face in simple things like getting to work, or you know, and the notion that you have to teach with armed occupying forces on the roofs of your school, or with tear gas in the local community, and that's in the normal times. I guess it must, you know, it's even more horrific now. And thanks for those statistics that you gave about the number of schools that had been destroyed. I think it's staggered everybody. There's almost like they are targeting schools and hospitals deliberately, and the toll of children in this war is absolutely heartbreaking, and I'm sure everybody agrees with that. Can I just ask a little bit more about the coalition of the trade unions that have sent out these requests? By the way, I'm Left Unity. I'm actually Left Unity's national trade union officer. I heard you speak at the Left Unity meeting recently as well, and it was a shame that we had. Well, it wasn't a shame, but we had so many speakers. There wasn't much time for any discussion in it. But thanks for attending that as well. Yeah, there are, I think, a number of things that we should be thinking about straight away. It is obviously difficult to get arms workers in the armaments industry and in the and who transport the arms to take action. There's real reluctance for trade union leaders to support that and to call for that. But there are things going on at a grassroots level, which I think are very, very important. There are model motions out there. My own union activists in Unite have produced a model motion, which I can give people a link to in the chat, or I can give to Carol afterwards. At least that starts to raise the demand and the possibility of trying to block arms manufacture and transport. It's obviously going to be a very difficult thing to do, but it is being done around the world. I believe there have been the dockers in Belgium, for example, have blocked shipments. There are, I think, there's action in Spain, Portugal, and in Australia too. That's just the ones I can think of off the top of my head, and it seems to be spreading. There have been a couple of. I was involved in one of them actually in Scotland, which probably didn't attract national attention, but was also one down in England of blockading. In Scotland's case, it was the arms manufacturer BAE Systems that we blockaded, and a number of unions took part on that. And I'm also pleased to see that there's a lot of work being done in the rank and file, if you like, of in the grassroots level in trade unions, to try and get unions to support the solidarity marches as well. I was on a big one in Edinburgh at the weekend. There were at least 5 trade union banners. That's the most I've seen for quite a while, and a whole block of trade unionists on that march, which was a good thing to see. But unfortunately, I don't know what it's been like down in the London marches, but unfortunately, there was no national trade union banners present. There was a lot of local branches and so on. And there has been, you know, fortunately, I think my own union, Unite, has been reasonably good. It calls for a ceasefire, but the statement has not been at all sharp enough in terms of condemning Israel and condemning the genocide and the war crimes that are being committed there. But we have managed to send round model motions to different branches, and some branches have had success in at least getting the motions passed by the branches and at branch level and getting support out onto the streets and so on. So I think it is something that I would agree with you. It's something that we must work on, to try and respond to this, because trade unions are absolutely vital in trying to put pressure on on Israel to stop this horrendous. I would call it genocide anyway.
Mm. Absolutely, Craig. Louise, would you like me to take Steve and John, and then you'll come back at the end? Okay. Thanks very much, Craig. Steve Freeman.
There we go. Hi, Louise. Thank you for your talk. It's very interesting, actually. And I think you sort of think this is how it might be, but it's quite different to hear somebody tell us about the actual concrete reality of it, as you did in your talk, which is really good. One of the things that kind of interests me was this sort of contradiction, or not contradiction really. On one hand, you have this in the West Bank, you have this kind of military dictatorship and the absolute denial of all civil liberties, the terrible treatment of people. Of course, Gaza is different. It's just a concentration camp, is it? It's only now becoming a military dictatorship by killing everybody and wiping everybody out. But in the West Bank, it's different. But I was interested when you said, and I think it's optimistic, I think, well, where is any democracy in the West Bank then? And it seemed from what you said as if this high engagement, if I've understood this correctly, of teaching trade unionists. So there is a democracy there, and it's in the working class, in amongst teachers. I think you say, I've got it right, meetings of 1,000 people there, for example, different to ours. So yeah, you have this repression, and then you have this response for where's the democracy? It's really down at the very grassroots level, down in the trade union. So I think that is really significant and interesting. That's all I was just wanted to, I think, to focus on. I'm probably not surprised at the last point is this. Again, I'm not surprised, or it's encouraging that Palestinians in the West Bank put so much emphasis on education for their children. And again, I think that's possibly when people are being oppressed, they're looking to the next generation to get ahead, get better. They're putting more to encourage them, and it seems that's what's kind of happened. And it might be the product of that very repressive society denying them their rights, and the defending of the culture of the people and all those things that take place. Anyway, that's all really, just a comment.
Thanks very much, Steve. I'm going to bring John Fitzgerald in now.
Oh, yeah. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Louise, for that talk. It's certainly, kind of the stark reality of it all. Very horrific in so many ways. I didn't realise that the Palestinian Authority, that funding had been stopped to the Palestinian Authority, who normally funded them in terms of pay for teachers or whatever. Who's been affected by this stopping of funding?
Thanks, John. I'm going to go back. I've got one more question I'd like to ask Louise as well. You said that the teachers, obviously the teachers in Gaza are receiving no salaries at the moment. What's the excuse for the teachers in the West Bank to receive no salaries, and how on earth are they managing?
Okay, I mean, I'll go through them in terms of what trade unions can do. Obviously, we live here in the UK under some of the most repressive anti-trade union laws. So obviously I understand. And also some of our unions do not feel confident taking up some of these issues, even though historically that there has been evidence that we have done that. But there are some good examples around the world of people who of trade unionists who are doing this, as in Belgium, as you said, and Spain. And we just need to keep engaging with those people, but also keep talking to members, because I think it will be grassroots activists that will make a difference. It's not going to be trade union leaders that will lead this. It will be people on the ground that will make a difference and change what is happening. There have been a few, as you said, that I didn't know about the one in Scotland, but in England there was a blocking of an arms factory by trade unionists who went and blocked it. And again, that was a very grassroots based. People just went. There was a call out amongst the trade union movement, and people that could go went and did that. And I suppose our job really is to sort of raise awareness of those things, but also to keep pushing it within our own unions. I mean, there is an issue with, certainly at the beginning, there was an issue with take up at a national union level, with people feeling anxious about it. And it's interesting because this always seems to come up when we get on to Palestine, Israel. There's always an anxiety about speaking out. But you know, more national unions have now taken a position on this. More national unions are attending the marches, and general secretaries are speaking at the national marches. I mean, interestingly, I spoke at an FBU event recently to activists, and their general secretary was saying there's been a couple of incidents where firefighters have refused to go where people have been occupying arms factories and things like that. And the police have called firefighters to get the people down, and the firefighters have said, no, it's not a fire risk. It's not our job to do that. You know, so there is evidence where people are doing these sort of thing. I mean, in terms of, yes, there is a high engagement with the union in the West Bank and Gaza, actually, and education is considered, in fact, education, if you look at the sort of standards, international standards, Gaza actually has a higher, slightly higher outturn than the West Bank in terms of attainment prior to now, where nobody's going to school. But there is a very big commitment. My Arabic teacher is from Gaza, and she, I talked to her a lot about education there and what is happening. And so she talks a lot about their high level of commitment to it. So there is that element of it. However, I think we have to recognize that, having lived under occupation, having lived in the situation they're living in, yes, they might engage at that level, but we, you know, the work we've been doing with them around engagement of women trade unionists has been really positive, not only for us as a union, in fact, learning from them and the things that they're doing and the things that they do really well, but also sort of empowering those women to get active within their trade unions. Just in terms of the funding, so that some of the Palestinian authorities' funding comes directly through, because of the occupation, comes directly through the Israeli government. So that is why that is having an impact on wages. But that isn't new. It's worse again at the moment. But historically, that has been the case. So there are times when funding is cut. And so there was a couple of years ago, there were a lot of strikes because teachers were only getting, in the West Bank, were only getting 2/3 of their salary. And their salaries aren't brilliant anyway. And in certain areas, so for example, teachers in East Jerusalem, it's very expensive to live. The cost of living in East Jerusalem is much higher, but they get the same salaries as other teachers. So there were a lot of concerns raised about that. And there's also, which I didn't mention, and somebody has referred to them teaching about their culture, there's a huge attempt in East Jerusalem to prevent teachers teaching the Palestinian curriculum. So part of the curriculum has been edited by the Israeli government. They're not allowed to teach about certain things. They're not allowed to teach about the Nakba or refer to it. The Palestinian flag is not allowed to be around and about in East Jerusalem. So there are some significant issues that educators are facing in terms of trying, one, to educate their young people about their history and what has happened, but also just about their own self-identification, who they are, and their own sort of rights. So, and sorry, I've forgotten what you asked me, Carol, because you did ask a final question, which I just haven't answered because I didn't write it down.
I think you did. You said the funding comes from Israel, and that's why they're not getting paid. They just cut their funding off. And I was wondering how on earth they were managing to survive if the salaries are just being cut off, because it's now several weeks. We're talking 2 months now since October the 7th. So how are these poor people managing?
I mean, you have to remember that for people in Gaza, 80% of the population are now internally displaced people who will be living in other temporary shelters, either schools, hospitals, or other UN buildings, just surviving on any aid that's getting in. Just in terms of, I mean, people may know these figures, but initially, from the 7th of October, for probably about 10 days, no aid at all entered. So prior to the 7th of October, 500 aid trucks a day, every day, entered Gaza just to sustain the population there who were already living under blockade by land, sea and air, and have been for 16 years. Then when they finally allowed the Rafah border to open for a small amount of aid to go in, 3% of the needed aid was going in. During the recent humanitarian pause, 30%, that increased to 30% of the needed aid per day, but it's now dropped back down to 3% again. So only 3% per day of the needed aid for the people who are internally displaced, which is now around approximately 80% of the population, is going in. And a number of aid organizations have said there is absolute risk of there are already some major health outbreaks, but of starvation and dehydration of the population because of lack of clean water and food.
Oh my goodness, this is absolutely heartbreaking. But I was also wondering about on the West Bank. I mean, obviously, I'm assuming that life is life not carrying on in the West Bank. Is that, has life sort of ground to a halt there as well? In terms of, you know, there's no teaching. You said is there no teaching going on in the West Bank?
No, there is teaching going on in the West Bank. It's very difficult. Quite hard because of the increased attacks, particularly and increased. So I talked about checkpoints, but actually the number of checkpoints has increased across the West Bank since 7th of October. But there is teaching going on. I mean, this isn't unusual. So over periods of time, there are times when educators don't get salary, or their salaries get cut because of various things that are happening. I mean, I have to say, educators' salaries there are not probably what keeps their household going, because their salaries are very low. So often, the majority of educators in classrooms are women. So there are male educators. More often than not, they're in leadership positions, but that's not unusual. That's the same here. So, I mean, I'm not going to criticize them for that. But I will to their faces when I'm talking to my friends there. But, you know, it's the way it is across the world, actually, going to any school, and that's how it works. But so you know, those educators are carrying on, and they will, whatever salary they can get, they will get. But my understanding was they were getting no salary or getting minimal salary because of the cuts to the PA funding.
Oh my goodness, I mean, I know it's not the worst thing that's happening, but you just one thing after another. I've got another couple of hands up, Louise. Would you be happy to take another couple of people? Phil, and then John again. Right, where's Phil gone? Phil, you've disappeared.
Hi there. First of all, apologies for arriving late. So I'm afraid I missed your contribution, and therefore I may be recovering ground. But I just wanted to make a couple of observations and maybe one question. First one, I was listening to, I think it was the Israeli ambassador, who's one of my favorite people at the moment, to London, who said that they really are talking about the need for denazification of Gaza once the operation is completed. and that would mean changing the entire curriculum of the schools there, if there are any left, into something more acceptable to the occupying authority. I find it very important and intriguing to see how the victims of this ethnic cleansing have been classed as Nazis. And that's everybody, because they're all guilty now. That's another thing. All your school children are pro-Hamas. They are all Nazis. They've got to be treated the same. And another thing I was going to say was that I think there's terminology which is difficult, which we need to grapple with when we're arguing the case for the Palestinians in the media, particularly. One of the terms refers to the actual attack on Gaza at the moment, and that is one of genocide. I think we need to be very clear what we mean and know what we mean about what genocide is. I'm sure we all do know, but the first challenge you'll get if you use the term on the radio is, oh, I don't think that's what it is. And I think we have to be able to say that, because the destruction of bakeries, schools, hospitals, and so on, the means of survival are all rungs on the ladder heading for genocide. They may not be genocidal in themselves, but they add up to it. The second one would be the term apartheid, where they're very keen to push back on the fact that Israel is not an apartheid state, because Arab Israelis live there 20%, they're very happy there and all the rest of it. So we need to be able to have our terms defined when we are defending the Palestinian cause in the media. And I guess the last question would be, well, will there be any education, Louise, when this is over? If they've destroyed 65,000 buildings and they've only managed to kill 3,000 terrorists / freedom fighters, it comes to mind that there's so little infrastructure left, and they do seem to be targeting UN schools, any schools they can find they're targeting. It's the erasure, isn't it, of an entire system of education, which will be followed on the West Bank with what the Americans used to term forced draft urbanization, in other words, creation of Bantustan. That's all I had to say.
Thanks very much. I've got hands again. John, I'm going to bring John in now again.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, you say with the Palestinian Authority. So, if those strikes you were talking about in the West Bank and Gaza around education, did they have to actually negotiate with Israel as to what their position was, what their demands were, increase in pay, or was that actually done through the Palestinian Authority?
Good question.
I'm kind of concerned because there's a lot of talk about Palestinian Authority, being corrupt in various ways, and although they've had a certain amount of funding cut, probably a big part, is it? Well, you can tell me, but yeah, so it just leaves you kind of wonder as to how the teachers are relating to the Palestinian Authority and through Israel.
I've got Steve again. Steve, I'll just bring you in.
Yeah, so I was just going to slight comment to Phil, but he was on the button with what he said. I tend to use myself the word genocidal as opposed to genocide, meaning a war that is tending to genocide. I think genocide is what happened after you've killed everybody. Well, when it's all over, you go, well, that's a genocide, but that's not what we're doing. We're dealing with a genocidal war that is tending to genocide, which ends up in genocide. And when it will become clear, and we're using that term in order to stop becoming a genocide by raising that term genocidal, I think we're saying this is so bad that it will end up in genocide if it goes on. That's my thought on that.
Yes, I mean, this is an awful thing to say, but the fact that we've now only got 3% of the amount of aid required getting into Palestine, we're now going to see, as Louise has said, dehydration, malnutrition, disease. I guess they're just hoping that will finish finish the job for them. It's just horrendous. It's just too horrendous. So, Louise, if you'd like to come back.
No,
I
mean,
terribly sorry. We seem to have more hands up now. This is generated.
Oh, do you want to go back to them, and I'll wait.
Yeah, is it all right? You okay? Have you got time? It's okay, right? Thanks. I've got Craig. Craig, I don't think John. You've had 2 goes already. I'm not going to bring you again.
Okay.
So I'm bringing Craig.
Yeah, I don't want to say very much. I mean, I think it's been a very good discussion, and thanks a lot, Louise. That was very, it's really opened my eyes to a lot of the issues. I just wanted to say, Carol, I've stuck a couple of links in the chat to both downloadable leaflets that can be used when we're raising the question in our union branches, or even on demonstrations and so on, about arms boycotts and the blockading of arms companies, the disruption of manufacture and transport and so on. Because I think Louise is absolutely right. It is going to be the grassroots where we will start that kind of process going, and it's a process that is desperately needed. I think the power of the trade union movement to have an impact on what's going on is very, very clear in my mind. It's just a question of getting that confidence re-established. We saw some glimpses of the re-emergence of rank and file grassroots organizations during the recent strike wave, but it's still only a glimmer. But anyway, those are just practical things. I think at least one of them has a link to model motions that can be used in trade union branches and in trades councils and other labour movement organisations as well. If those links don't work, though, I'll send them to you, Carol, as well. Okay.
Yes, could you? I was going to say that, Craig, if you could email them to me, that would be really, really good, and I can then email them straight out to everybody. Yeah, I mean, and this controlling of the curriculum, this is so colonial, isn't it? Controlling what they can read about their own history. I mean, we've seen it with our education system, and it's getting worse and worse. When do we ever in our education system learn about the levelers, for instance, or the Chartists, or all the socialist history of our own country? How often is that taught, in our schools? But it must be 100 times worse in Israel. So I think we'll go back to Louise now to give her concluding remarks. And I think Jennifer had a very good question for you on another topic. If you can give
I'm going to answer that. I'm going to answer that at the end. Just very quickly. I mean, I think I tend to use the term genocidal or genocidal acts. And I think that's right, because that is where we're at. So I think it's just our language. Language is really important that we use, because that is what we are always judged on. And that's certainly what I think we need to think about. In terms of the issue of apartheid, well, it is well documented now from numerous organizations. B'Tselem, which is an Israeli human rights organization, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. These organizations took a long time to come to that position and to produce those reports. They're very well documented. They're really good reports. If you haven't read them, I would urge you to read them. And what I would have to say, personally, from my point of view, is as somebody who has been many times to the West Bank, then what they say in those reports are things that I have witnessed happening. So sometimes people say, well, you just saying that. Well, I've witnessed the things that they're talking about. I've witnessed the separation wall. I've witnessed the stealing of land. I've witnessed the new roads being built that are settler-only roads. I've witnessed all of those things happening as time has progressed. So I think it is perfectly reasonable, and we should be referring it to it as an apartheid state. And that is why they want us to stop saying it, because there is so much evidence that it is. So there is this massive attempt to shut us down. Just in terms of the strikes, just to be clear, the strikes that took place in the West Bank. Just to be clear, Gaza is ruled by Hamas, so that's their ruling. They were elected into power in Gaza in 2000, whenever, 16 years ago. So they were elected as the ruling power there. So in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority are the ruling authority. So they're two separate systems. So what happens in the West Bank will not always be the same, even though the GUPT do represent teachers in Gaza. So the strikes that took place were around their salaries, and GUPT negotiate with Palestinian Authority, not with Israel. Israel has no input into what happens within Ramallah and within the sort of ruling district within that, theoretically. I mean, talking about the Palestinian Authority is a whole separate topic. You know, it's like there are lots of people who raise concerns about this or that. That's just a separate issue, really. But in terms of the strikes were against the Palestinian Authority and against the funding that was coming through to educators. So that I think that answers all of the questions that came up. Just on a separate issue, you emailed me separately, Carol, around the government's latest threat that they're going to stop education workers in the UK striking. So this links to what is called the minimum service level agreements. So this is some new legislation they're bringing in as a government, saying that certain industries, there will have to be a minimum service level agreed. And they were trying to, well, their attempt, and it was leaked in the Sun newspaper, I think, was to try and negotiate with us to get us to give up our rights to strike, which obviously we're not going to do as a union. Why would we? That's our right as a human right to withdraw our labour. So basically, TUC has got a big special conference this Saturday to talk about the minimum service levels. I think, because this is my personal view, I mean, I don't know what the government thinks, but this is what I think the government thinks, that the NEU had a huge amount of strike action last year, had very, huge membership. We've shown that we can and will take industrial action to defend our members' pay. They knew they weren't going to put any new funding into schools or give us a decent pay award this year, which is the case. And they know that the likelihood is that we will therefore go back to our members around that issue. And so I think they are trying to stop, their view is, well, we'll shut down them taking strike action by pushing through these minimum service level agreements, which would basically mean that the majority of children had to be in school because of either because they were SEND, they had EHCP, there was other issues in place, they're a primary pupil, they're in an exam year group, all these things that they say, therefore that child has to be in school to try and prevent us taking industrial action. So we haven't, I mean, obviously at the moment they haven't imposed that on us yet, but that is where that newspaper report came from, is that there is an attempt by the government through the minimum service level agreements to try and prevent education workers. And I mean, looking at what they are saying in that article, that it would really mean that a large percentage of our members would not be able to take action. So we will. I've been in a reps training day today, and one of our reps, raised it and said, what is happening? So people are starting to become aware of this, and it is something we'll be talking to members about, and I'm sure it's something that will come up going forward at our national conference.
Yes, this is something that when this minimum service level was raised, one of our group, who isn't here at the moment, Peter Grant, has been talking about this for about a year, giving us very good advice and what it will mean and so on. I thought to myself, well, if they are insisting on a minimum service level, every teacher will have to be in school, because every class will have to be covered. That's exactly what I was worried about for teachers. And of course, this is quite deliberate, because they know that teachers can bring the country to a standstill. Because if they withdraw all childcare, then loads of people can't go to work. And this is the power that teachers have. So for goodness sake, Louise, go back and fight for that. They must not be allowed to take away the teachers' right to strike. Absolutely not.
Don't worry, we won't.
Or anybody else's.
No, That's right. They're not taking any of us. We've all got a right to strike, and we're going to fight for it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Louise, for giving us, an hour of your time. That's really kind of you. And it's been a really illuminating, fascinating talk. I mean, depressing and sad and harrowing as well, but a very necessary talk, I think. So thank you so much for coming and talking to us. And all the best, and get to the end of term.
Definitely. Thank you, everyone.